Good evening. I am delighted to be here, always feeling privileged to have this opportunity to introduce you to the initiative at the University of Arizona on innovations in healthy aging. We are so delighted to have Dr. Laura Howard tonight as our speaker, and I will be telling you a little bit more about her. I am Kathy Ensel, Director of the Innovations in Healthy Aging, and I thank you for joining us for the first Innovations in Healthy Aging lecture for the spring. I also want to give you a very brief overview of our initiative. It won't surprise any of you that the percentage of people who are 65 years of age and older has increased in our nation. I'm part of that baby boom generation, so I am very familiar with the impact that we've had as I've gone through life. What may surprise you is that in Arizona, it's even greater. Maybe that won't surprise you after all either. But people generally, nationally, the percentage of older adults who are 65 and older has gone up about 32%. In Arizona, 48%. And people at 85 and older are our largest growing age group. So what to do? The university was so proactive with this. I'm grateful to the leadership of Dr. Dake here at the Arizona Health Science Center for identifying aging as one of the strategic priorities in our community. Our primary aim is to influence the critical factors that affect the health of a growing aging population. Also, I want to talk with you a little bit about how we are trying to address this aging opportunity that we have. We're trying to build an age-friendly university. So what does that mean? That means that the university is part of the community, and the community is part of the university. We want a pathway that's in and out. We want you to feel like you belong here. We want you to know that we are addressing issues that are important to you. And also, if you have any suggestions about future talks that you would like to hear or experts that you'd like to hear from on our campus, please let us know. The Building an Age-Friendly University is a global-wide organization that has been occurring over several years. What it means is outreach and engagement, changes in physical environment. So we're trying very hard to address parking challenges for people. We have to have this at 5:30 so you don't have to worry about parking right next to the building. But we'd like to do better than that. It means research, not just bench research and not only bench research, not that it's just, but research that's important to understanding what we can do to positively impact the opportunities we have in aging. It also means service and resources. So I want to introduce you to a couple of my colleagues. I'm very grateful. It's a unique and synergistic collaborative effort among Dr. Esther Sternberg on the left as you face the screen, Dr. Mindy Fain on the right. Without these persistent and consistent efforts of these amazing women, this initiative would not have launched and been sustained. I also want to thank not Dr. Anissa Westcott, I just gave you a promotion, but Anissa Westcott is the backbone of this initiative, and I realize that every day. She's part of this leadership team, and next time I want to try to get a picture of the four of us together. I also want to acknowledge again Dr. Michael Dake, SVP of the University of Arizona Health Sciences, the co-creator of the initiative at the beginning, and for his continuous support. I also want to thank the Office of Strategic Initiatives, and in particular Jane Hunter, Vice President of Strategic Initiatives. This aging initiative has really sparked collaboration among all people at the university. Today, I want to give you a heads up for the next lecture that we're going to be having, and that's a balancing act, staying upright as we age, which I thought, gee, I need to hear about that. This lecture series is for you, our community members. You can learn more about what we have in store by visiting the events section of our website. Now, Dr. Laura Howard is a professor of practice at the James E. Rogers College of Law, bioethics faculty at the Phoenix College of Medicine, and a retired associate professor of philosophy at the University of Arizona. Dr. Howard's area of specialty is in normative and applied ethics, and she teaches courses covering topics on medical ethics, regulations, and ethics for healthcare professionals, aging, and social justice. Her current scholarship interests involve environmental health ethics. Dr. Howard, welcome, and thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Welcome tonight. Thank you for coming. I understand there's a lot of people online that are joining in with us tonight. So thanks to all of you out there, wherever you might be. And to those of you who came out and are in attendance here tonight, thank you very much for coming out on kind of a windy and cold night, not typical for Tucson. I also want to say it was really kind of you not to groan out loud when you heard that I was a philosopher. But it was kind of you, it really was, because I get it. There are philosophers I know that would make me want to run away. I won't mention any names. But tonight I hope that I can share with you a part of philosophy that you'll find important and interesting, namely ethics, and also just a tiny bit of conceptual analysis about aging and social justice. Aging and social justice is the name of a graduate course that I teach for James E. Rogers College of Law here at the University of Arizona. And so tonight I thought that in this talk I would give you an introduction to some of the topics that we cover in that course and see what you think. I've laid it out as 3 questions that we'll cover. What is aging? That's the conceptual analysis part. It'll be brief, don't worry. What is ageism? What is ageism? And third, who should take care of the older adult in need? That's the social and political philosophy that we'll cover. Okay, so what is aging? Well, now on the face of it, this might seem like actually a silly question because, well, time passes, you get older, that's aging. But let's take just a little bit deeper dive into what the concept of aging is, what the concept of time is, and the language that we use to talk about these things. So first of all, everyone changes and ages. A 2-year-old is changing and aging, and when that 2-year-old is 4, they've made a lot of changes. When they're 6, even more. When they're 8, even more. And in the young child, we think that's a good thing. This goes on throughout life, of course, but in children, we think change is good because it means gains. They're gaining things. But aging also comes with losses, and those losses come throughout life. For example, even a 30-year-old has felt some loss or has some loss. For example, 30-year-old bones aren't as rubbery and flexible as 2-year-old bones, and a fall that would break the bones of a 30-year-old wouldn't faze a 2-year-old. Those bones have gotten more brittle. But we don't call the 30-year-old aged. So when does that happen? When do we go from aging to being aged? When do we shift from just getting older to being old? All right? Well, I submit that a big part of that reason is because we live our lives on a timeline. We have a conception of life as being lived out on a timeline. And this timeline, it's finite. It has a definite beginning and a definite end. You're born, and then you die, and it's finite, okay? And we conceive of this timeline as being something that we move along in only one direction, and as we rack up time back here, this part is compressing, this part's closing in. It's taking a bite out of our future. I mean, at T30, we're older than we were at T20. At T40, we're older than we were at 350, so on and so forth. So when exactly does it happen that we become old? And why do we have such a conception of time? Well, a German philosopher by the name of Max Scheler, around the turn of the 20th century, said, you know, this isn't necessarily something that we just innately have, this concept of time. He argued that it's a social construction, it's a human artifact, this concept of aging and time. And he said, think of this, and this is a thought experiment, an imaginary thought experiment. I'm going to adapt it and shorten it, but here's essentially what it is. Imagine that you are a small child and you find yourself on a deserted island. There's no other humans, no other animals of any sort, no animals on this island. And somehow or another you manage to survive. The sun comes up, the sun goes down, the sun comes up, the sun goes down. This keeps happening, and you notice changes in your body, you know, from the time you're a young child. But having never seen another animal age and die, Scheler says, you would never have an actual concept of this timeline that keeps squeezing you toward the end. You wouldn't have that concept. It's something that we construct ourselves. So, you know, not everybody agrees with Scheler about this. Some people think that we do have this innate sense of time passing. But it's interesting to think about why we are so obsessed with time. And we are. We have this cultural obsession with time and age. I mean, we live our lives on a calendar and by our watches and our phones, and we're constantly checking the time. We celebrate our birthdays every single year. You know, there are some societies where they don't. They don't celebrate birthdays, and some people in those societies don't even know how old they are. But we sure do, and we're reminded of it constantly. Our societal institutions never let us forget. When we're 16, we can drive. When we're 18, we can vote. When we're 21, we can drink. When we're 35, we can run for president. When we're 40, apparently it's time to start spending a lot of money on anti-aging products. 50 is the new 40, in case you haven't heard. And 60, a lot happens in the 60s. When you're 62, you're eligible for Social Security. When you're 65, you're eligible for Medicare. At 70, Social Security maxes out, and so they tell us we ought to start taking it then. When we're 72, we have to start taking from our IRA, right? So a lot of reminders. There's a lot of things we can't do anymore after a certain age. The FAA requires commercial airline pilots to retire at 65. And for the rest of us who pilot cars instead of jets, once we turn 70, we're likely to have to do our licensing renewal and testing more often. Did you know in some countries in Europe, you can't rent a car if you're 70 or over? I have a good friend who just recently went on a cruise and was denied the opportunity to go on a scuba diving excursion. You know why? He's too old. This is a 75-year-old man who is more fit than a lot of people half his age. He's been a certified scuba diver for over 40 years, and he's a retired firefighter and paramedic. But he can't go scuba diving. They said he could snorkel, though, in the shallow end. So we do have this, these constant reminders of how we're getting old. So as we do get older, and we are, as I say, constantly reminded of it, at some point in time, we actually might find ourselves the object of an ism, an ageism, okay? So what is ageism? Well, the World Health Organization defines it as such. Ageism refers to the stereotypes, how we think, the prejudice, how we feel, and the discrimination, how we act towards others or oneself based on age. So let's start with stereotypes. Oh, I want to make two qualifications, though. We, up here, doesn't mean all of us. Not everyone is an ageist, just like not everyone is a sexist or a racist, okay? So that's one qualification about the we. The other thing I want to point out is that ageism does apply across the continuum of age, and so young people experience ageism too, stereotypes and prejudice and discrimination, okay? But I'm focusing tonight on ageism as it applies to the older adult. So, stereotypes, how we think about older adults. They're weak and physically compromised. They're cognitively impaired. They're unproductive. And they're grumpy. If that's what people think about us, maybe that's why we're so grumpy. Yeah. But these are just the generalizations that people make about us. And sometimes it's funny. Stereotyping older people is meant to be funny anyway, especially in advertising. There's the "Don't become your parents" commercials, yeah. There's the bank card commercial where the daughter is talking to her father, who is apparently an idiot because he doesn't know anything about credit scores. There's dozens of commercials about the liquor swizzling race car driving granny. And of course there was obnoxious Medicare Martha, which if you watched television last November, you may have seen and gotten enough of her. And I did an internet search of, I think I put in commercials that make fun of old people, and I was astonished at how many there are and have been and continue to be. Although a lot of people don't think they're so funny, and the reason is because they say, I cannot imagine a marketing company launching an ad campaign that stereotypes and makes fun of people based on race or sex or sexual orientation or ethnic affiliation or religion, and yet old people are fair game. Yeah. So there's a lot of study being done about this to ask, why that is. And of course, people will say, well, we live in such a youth culture, that's part of it. But they also point to older people themselves as perpetuating the stereotype. If you're an older person like me, you might make fun of yourself from time to time about being a senior, right? But other age groups don't do that so much. Ashton Applewhite, in a recent TED Talk, she quips that when a teenager misplaces their keys, they don't say, "Oh, I must be having a junior moment." And when my left knee hurts, why do I blame it on old age? My right knee feels fine and it's just as old. And this can happen before we're even out of middle age. For the last 20 years, my sister, on my birthday every year, has been sending me a droopy boob card. Every year, for 20 years. I mean, I was only 20 years, I was only 42. 47. I'm 67. This is a good time, though, being older. This is a good time to be older. So I get discounts everywhere I go. That's good. But you know, as much as it's okay to have fun and make fun of yourself, and psychologists tell us that humor is good, it's good to be able to laugh at yourself. Once it crosses a line, though, and it becomes hurtful, then it becomes a social problem. And things kind of get ramped up when we start talking about prejudice, because now prejudice is about the way people feel about older adults. And so these are just a couple of examples. Older adults are slow. They get in my way. They take too much of society's resources, like health care. And I'll have more to say about that in just a moment. And Social Security. Apparently, a large number of young people resent paying into the Social Security and Medicare system. In a recent Forbes poll, 47% of millennials and 83% of Gen Xers strongly agreed that, quote, "I will not get a dime of the Social Security benefits that I've earned." Whether this is true or not, I don't know. I'm not an economist. But these are the feelings that can fuel ageism. And in my informal polls that I take of older adults, they tell me they can feel this kind of prejudice when they're out and about, you know, and they're at the grocery store and they're going too slow and they're in the way in the aisles, or they get honked at driving because they're going too slow, being too cautious. So prejudice can hurt. It's felt on both ends. Finally, I'd like to turn to talk about discrimination, which probably the most serious of all. And that's how we actually behave and act toward older adults. And I want to take this in reverse order, actually. So communication discrimination is something that involves just the everyday things that have to do with trying to get information and trying to make transactions that are not friendly to the older adult. Small print. It's everywhere. I mean, even in places where, you know, older adults really need to be able to read the thing. It's just the print is just too small. Fast talking. A decade ago, the average rate of human speech was 145 words per minute. Today, it's 180. Decibel levels on automated telephone recordings are geared for the average hearing adult. And did you know that touchscreen technology is such that if your fingers are dried and calloused, it won't work as well. Now, that's not to say that all older adults have dry and calloused fingers and other people don't. Lots of people have this, but it is more prevalent to have dry hands. And touchscreen technology has not been changed in order to accommodate that actual fact. And, you know, for the person who hasn't grown up with technology and has to learn it later in life, just having to fill out online forms and transactions can be very difficult. Has anybody gotten to the end of an online form and accidentally pressed the wrong button and deleted the whole thing? Yeah. I had no idea that Alt and backspace was delete. You learn things the hard way sometimes. Healthcare rationing by age. Okay. This is actually an extremely important topic, and it's hotly debated in medical ethics. So examples of age-based healthcare rationing are things like denying procedures like knee replacements and scopes and things like that to people after they're a certain age. Longer wait times for things like MRIs. Increased cost of insurance to restrict access to older patients, and less attentive and even dismissive treatment by healthcare professionals. Proponents, people who are in favor of age-based rationing, think that age does matter when it comes to allocating scarce resources in healthcare. Bioethicist Daniel Callahan, for instance, proposes that the government refuse to pay for life-extending medical care for people aged 70 or 80, and only pay for routine care aimed at relieving pain. Now, there are opponents of age-based health care rationing, who argue that the economic consequences aren't the only things that we should consider. They say, consider if we had a policy in place, a national policy that had a cutoff age after which you can't have any more life-extending medical care. You can only have what relieves you of pain. Think of how that will affect young people. As they age, the anxiety and fear that they will feel as they become older adults and realize that they're not going to be eligible for certain kinds of health care. Not only that, but they point out that in a just and fair system, you have to give the same kind of benefits to people who are in similar conditions. And where healthcare is concerned, it has to do with your need for the healthcare. It has to do with your potential for recovery, and it has to do with the potential for it to improve quality of life. And age has nothing to do with those any more than race or sex does. And so only when you have a morally relevant difference can you justify a morally relevant, or a morally different treatment. So a lot of times people focus on the actual financial fiscal cost that older adults can maybe bring to bear, but want to urge that there's a whole lot more that needs to be considered in terms of quality of life and fair and just allocation of resources. Now, my sources for the previous statements, they come from the AMA Journal of Ethics and the Markula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University. If anybody wants any of these citations, by the way, I have them. But my own source for talking about age-based healthcare comes from years of teaching medical ethics to undergraduates. And I've taught this one course for dozens of times to literally hundreds, if not 1,000 students. And I always have this one exercise that I do in the classroom. It's a thought experiment. It's an imaginary thought experiment, but it goes like this. I tell the students, listen, you are on a health committee. You're a member of a health committee, and here's what's happening. You have 8 people, all of whom are in the same medical condition and need the same resources, healthcare resources to save their lives. But you only have enough for 4. Right? So you have to pick the 4. You have to pick the 4 that get saved and the 4 that don't. And then I have a list of these 8 people. I think I have, I can't remember all that. I have a 24-year-old female paramedic. I have a 45-year-old female with 3 children. I have a 50-year-old felon with 3 children. I have a grandmother of 4. I can't remember them all. I have an 80-year-old retired chemist. So 2 things, and then they all have to vote, and then I tally up all the votes, okay? 2 things emerge from this. Pardon me, I thought I had this on silence. Okay. 2 things emerge every single time without fail. First, oh, I forgot to tell you, and one of the patients is a 2-year-old. okay? That's important because what happens is the 2-year-old always gets the most votes, and the 85-year-old always gets the least, if any, okay? The second thing is that at the end of this whole exercise, I tell them, oh, by the way, the 2-year-old that you saved grows up to be a serial killer, and the 85-year-old you let go was on the verge of discovering a cure for cancer. And they're horrified, but it brings out this bias that we have toward the value of life and how it's tied to age. And it's ubiquitous. I mean, we find it everywhere. And like I said, every time I've done this exercise, it always turns out the same way. Now, we go on and we talk about more ethics and more medical ethics, and I hope that by the end of the term, the students have learned that whether this is a conscious or an unconscious bias, it's something that we need to be aware of. Next, possibly, I mean, healthcare rationing's pretty bad, but job discrimination is probably felt by a lot more people. I would like to share with you a bit about the Age Discrimination in Employment Act. It was passed in 1967, and I claim no expertise in this area. I rely on my colleagues who are lawyers and legal experts. They keep up with the current cases and the changes in this area. Special thanks to my colleague and friend law professor Tara Sklar for helping me with this topic. Before the ADE Act was passed by Congress in 1967, it was common practice to advertise jobs to people 45 and younger. Others need not apply. And in addition to discriminatory hiring practices, there were discriminatory firing practices like, you've been here long enough, it's time for new blood. So the act has been helpful in that way to make those things illegal. But the act itself covers a lot of ground, and I can only mention a few things here. It's interesting to note that although the act was passed in 1967, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, in their 2015 survey that they did of corporations, they found that 64% of the firms they surveyed did have diversity and inclusion strategies, but only 8% of those included age. Forbes reports that while bias around sexuality and race has declined precipitously over the last 12 years, the one area where unconscious bias has barely shifted is ageism. Why is age discrimination a common problem in employment? Well, according to the Itkin law firm of San Francisco, it has to do with people's perceptions about the older worker, which have no basis in fact. The older worker is more expensive and less productive. They have the potential for more health care costs and absenteeism. Younger people are stronger, more reliable, and there's less absenteeism among them. That's not factually supported. Older workers are slow to learn technology. And again, none of these things are based in fact, but it's a perception. There's also a perception that the workforce needs to be prettier, especially in jobs like sales. Currently, several lawsuits are pending against companies who try to get around hiring restrictions. You can't ask about age, so they ask, when was your high school graduation? Or they advertise for people who are digital natives. You know what a digital native is? Yeah, someone who grew up with technology and didn't learn it later in life. So for all intents and purposes, that's advertising for a younger worker. But for all this, okay, discrimination, healthcare rationing, and communication discrimination, some people still would say that ageism, it isn't as bad as the other isms. It's not as bad. But this misses the point of what causes an ism. Stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination occurs when people don't understand what it's like to be part of a different group. Not too many years ago, a famous essay was written by a philosopher by the name of Thomas Nagel, and the name of the essay was, "What is it like to be a bat?" Okay? And in this essay, Nagel is urging this idea that there's a certain phenomenological feel. Phenomenology is just a highfalutin word for what it feels like, right? And so he said, you know, we can't know what it's like to feel like the member of a different group. And he uses a bat to make the point. He said, you can study a bat 24/7 for your whole career. You can live in the cave with them. You can dissect their bodies and put electrodes on their brain and watch everything that you can have, all the objective knowledge there is to have about a bat. But you can never know what it's like to hang upside down from the ceiling, to have echolocation, biosonar. You can't know what it's like, what it feels like to be a bat. And we can extrapolate this argument to we humans. We don't know what it's like to be a member of a different group that we're not part of, what it feels like. And this applies with age. A 10-year-old doesn't know what it's like to be 30. Well, 30-year-old doesn't know what it's like to be 60. A 60-year-old doesn't know what it's like to be 100 years old. So in this respect, and this is the same sort of argument that replies in other isms, you know, sexism, racism, so forth. And so the point is that ageism, insofar as it involves, you know, people in different age groups, it is an ism. And it's just as serious and just as bad as the other isms. So we should be keenly aware of the real implications that negative stereotyping and aging can have. There's something known as the stereotype threat in psychology, where people are known to conform to the stereotypes of their group. Psychologist Sarah Barber reports, people worry that there's truth to the negative stereotypes when they forget, when an older person forgets, oh no, I'm starting to suffer some cognitive decline, you know, dementia. And then they start to forget more. And so it kind of leads to this self-fulfilling prophecy of a sort. It's a stereotype threat, it's what it's called in the psychological literature. And it's not good when it's that prevalent. The World Health Organization reports that ageism is associated with earlier death by 7.5 years, poorer physical and mental health, and slower recovery from disability in old age. In the United States, 1 in every $7 spent on health care for the 8 most expensive conditions was due to ageism, $63 billion. Well, that's a lot of negatives I've been talking about regarding older adults. So I want to just spend just a minute here talking about a positive stereotype. Older people are wise. Now we know that, we all know older people that, that aren't wise. Getting older doesn't guarantee wisdom. But older adults have a lot to offer. They can make excellent mentors in the workplace to younger workers. Retired people have time for getting involved in charities and political organizations in their post-career activities. And just as an example, there's this great program at the University of Leeds in England. It was founded by Dr. Georgina Binney, and it's called the Writing Back Program. And what they do is they pair older adults with university students, and they become pen pals. And they become pen pals for years. And they share each other's life challenges. They help with loneliness and homesickness, and the older adult shares with life challenges, and they become fast, long friends. It's a great program. I wish we would have more universities that would institute something like that. When I have time, I think I want to try that here at the University of Arizona. There's a lot of positive things that adults bring, older adults bring. But for all of the benefits that they do bring, there often comes a time in life when the older adult is no longer able to be productive or begins to experience accelerated physical and/or cognitive decline. In 2022, in the first nationally representative study of cognitive impairment in more than 20 years, Columbia University researchers have found that almost 10% of US adults aged 65 and older have dementia, while another 22% have mild cognitive impairment. By age 90, 35% of people have dementia. So these aging changes are real, and at some point in life, an older adult may need care. Not everybody, in fact, not even a majority, but some people do. And so let's turn to our final question: who should take care of the older adult in need? This is the social justice part. And so I'm going to share a little bit of social and political philosophy with you in trying to answer this question. So when social and political philosophers and legal experts and legislators and so forth are trying to come up with policies regarding these sorts of things, they want to appeal to general theories and principles to underpin their views. Otherwise, it just becomes people arguing about their opinions, which many times can just be about their preferences or their feelings. And so I'll talk just a little bit about the general moral principles that go toward justifying different views about who should be responsible. So who should be responsible? Well, in years past, families lived in multi-generational households, right? And so there were younger children there to take care of grandparents, and this was just expected. It was the duty of the family to take care of the older adult. But in modern times, that's not quite so easy. Our families are spread out all over the place. We have two earner families where both people have to work. And so it's very difficult, and we know about the burdens that people experience. Some folks, they lose their savings. They lose their home. They lose their jobs. They have no time to spend with their children because they're taking care of their parents. They have no social life. So the costs can be quite extreme to caregivers of older adults in the home. And so this brings us to the question of whether or not all of us in society, and thus the government, should be responsible for taking care of our aging population and people when they become older adults. Now, there's different lines of argument that justify this position for government intervention. I'll just mention a couple. Some people say that, well, the job of the government is to make things as good as possible for as many people as possible. Any of you that have had any philosophy might recognize that as utilitarian reasoning. The principle of utility says to maximize the good and minimize the bad or minimize the pain. And that's not always cashed out in dollars, but there's other kinds of pain associated as well. And so the one thing to recognize about this principle, though, is that it doesn't guarantee a good outcome for everyone. It's about aggregate good, and some people will fall through the cracks. So there's a different line of reasoning that some social and political philosophers use, according to which what really justifies everyone getting what they need is a principle of honoring people's right to be cared for, their right to be treated as intrinsically worthwhile, as being deserving of our care when they are dependent. Some of those arguments go like this. Look, we take care of our children who are dependent, right? And we don't call them a burden in the same way. All of us at some point in life are in need. We're dependent on friends and family, even if it's just temporarily. So this line of argument says that rights are what underpin a society's obligation to take care of its aging population, and it ought to apply to everyone. No one falls through the cracks. That's that argument, okay? Now, this third suggestion up here, that the aging adult themselves ought to take care of themselves. There are different lines of argument about this. Probably one that's easiest to understand is that people should just be going through their lives developing a plan for their older life. They should develop some virtues of character such that they don't overspend and they save enough money, and they know when the time comes that they need the courage and the wisdom to take care of things for themselves. So that's how that argument goes. Now, a lot of people ask me, well, how are you supposed to adjudicate between these different positions and these different principles and theories? How do you decide? Well, I like to think of all of these things as being part of a big toolbox. And when you have a job, you need lots of tools. And this is a big job. So rather than thinking about choosing just one thing as being right and all the rest are wrong, having conversation and discussion about compromise and about pulling the best of all of these ideas together can lead towards solutions. I don't think perfection is possible, but certainly improvement is. So I just have a few words to conclude here with. I want to wrap up by saying something about why I wanted to give this talk and about why I like to teach this course. As a philosopher, my job is to analyze concepts, to ask a lot of questions, and to consider the ethical implications of our thoughts and feelings and behaviors. And as an educator, my job is to bring those ideas to the awareness of others who are working in fields where these ethical issues are pressing concerns. Where aging and ageism is concerned and the care of aging adults, I believe we need more people giving more thought and attention to these ethical issues. Each time I teach the Aging and Social Justice course, I'm encouraged and touched by my students, all of whom are either working in or pursuing a line of work in the care of older adults. Law students who want to specialize in age discrimination and employment law. administrators and nurses and other caregivers in long-term care facilities, directors and caregivers in occupational health and rehabilitation units, physicians who specialize in gerontology, real estate specialists who negotiate senior housing contracts, scientists in pharmacology who work on treatments for diseases associated with aging. These are people who understand the importance of these ethical and social issues, as are you, or you wouldn't have joined me here tonight, and you didn't run away. Thank you very much. Thank you.
This is the scary part.
I have a question from the home audience.
Oh, okay.
What states/countries is ageism more prominent in, and where is it not as prominent?
Oh, wow. I don't know. You know, my work really does focus on Western society, especially in the United States. And that's mainly because a lot of what I do is work with lawyers who are doing work here in the United States. Although I was just recently reading about a survey in Europe. This is also becoming an emerging area of academic research, and it's pretty active over there as well. I'm trying to remember now the references, and I'm not recalling, but they have the same sorts of. They're a Western culture in that they have the same sorts of youth culture concerns and aging populations. They have aging populations as well. As far as like any countries that maybe don't experience ageism, I would have to say those the countries I mentioned earlier, and I'm not going to be able to name them either, but I do have a citation for that if the person would like me to give it to them, but where they don't even keep track of their age. They probably don't have the same sort of concerns that we do.
I'll take this off. I read an article that mentioned that China.
Where are you?
I'm up here. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Okay.
Sorry. That China directed its vaccines toward younger people and not to the older folks. Do you happen to know what their age cutoff was?
In China?
Yeah.
I don't. I don't. I do know, though, that what we had during COVID was being studied now as an example of healthcare rationing, age-based healthcare rationing. I just read an article about that. Initially we thought during COVID that a lot of people thought that the older adults were being they were given preferential treatment, okay, where vaccines were concerned. As it turned out, though, over the course of the pandemic, the actual health care that was given to people favored those who were younger and had a higher probability of survival. So the age-based healthcare rationing was actually a thing during COVID. I'm sorry that I don't know the exact answer to your question about China.
Turn this on. There we go. Hi, Dr. Howard, thank you so much for such a provocative and interesting talk.
Thank you.
I'm a physician. I work in Mexico in indigenous communities. And one of the things I'd like you to speak about a little bit is something I observe when I come back to this culture. I know your specialty is in Western culture, but I find society here tending away from humanity and citizenship and more to consumerism and materialism. And I think that there's a filter with ageism that is very materialist, and it's lost its ethic of integrity. And I know neurologically, our right and left hemispheres as we get older integrate more, where we have an integrity of value and thought that can tend toward wisdom. I see that in the indigenous communities that I serve, that the elders may not be sharp on detail, but they're definitely sharp with their heart. And there's a gentleman who works with us in audiology for elders and worked here at the University of Arizona, and he had indigenous students, the other aspect of this, that weren't oriented to competitiveness. They were oriented to serve and be present. And he changed the curricula. And I think that it disappeared out of the University of Arizona in speech pathology and audiology. But I'd love to see more thoughts about that, because the indigenous integrity with aging, I find to be an example of important humanity. And I'd love to hear you tell me what your thoughts are.
Thank you for that. That's really interesting. I thought of a few things as you were talking. One is that when I was working on my dissertation years ago, I had a chapter in my dissertation about I did a meta study on all of these experiments that were done mostly in psychology and mostly in rational choice theory, where people are given a scenario and they have to make a choice based on what would be the most rational outcome, right? And interestingly, what I found out is that older people, although they were slower in making their decisions, they were across the board more fair and compassionate in the choices that they made. And what was interesting is that there was this whole body of literature in philosophy about, it's called situationism, and it's the idea that our morality is dictated by the situation that we're in, and that we really don't have any enduring virtuous dispositional character. We're always going to be affected by what's in the situation and pressured by what's in the situation. And these were based on a lot of experiments that were done. As it turns out, all of the subjects of these experiments were college students. Nothing against college students, okay? But there was a big difference in the way that the experimental results came out when you did it with 18-year-olds or you did it with mature adults, right? And I mean, it goes to your comment about, the more, I think you used the word compassion, and you said there's, greater integrity and there's more considerations than just materialism. Yeah. So that my second point then was going to be about a lot of times, and I think I mentioned this in the talk, a lot of times, lots of us, social and political theorists and legal analysts and even psychologists, tend to do these cost-benefit analysis that are definitely more concerned with fiscal outcomes, right? So it's almost always about the money, right? And one thing in moral philosophy that we talk a lot about is that you can't really quantify people's happiness, people's pleasure, and people's pain, right? So there's a certain quality, and I'll just briefly say what I'm thinking about here. So when you think about, like a family who's having to take care of and eventually say goodbye to an aging adult, how are you gonna assign the value of the pain when that aging adult doesn't receive the care that you want them to because they're past the cutoff age. And how are you going to square all of that with the actual pain? How are you going to assign these quantitative values to the family's feelings and even society at large? A lot of people don't take into consideration how it affects society at large when you pass policies that are prejudicial towards older adults, because young people care too. They have older adults they care about. They're going to be older someday. And these are things that never get factored into these studies and these experiments and stuff. Now, you're an expert on indigenous culture, and I'm not, but I'm certainly sympathetic to this idea that we don't think enough about these other considerations, these other consequences of our policy-making decisions and so forth, when all we're thinking about is the money. I don't know, I'm telling you what I think.
It's just that the consumerism
is
really reducing our humanity. And
she's saying that the consumerism is reducing our humanity.
My question observation is that ageism is not an equal opportunity ism. And it seems to me that women experience ageism at least a decade before men do. And it's a kind of a shocking thing for a woman to be like 40 and realize, she's not in the front office anymore and stuff like that. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
Thank you. That's a good observation. When I had that one slide I put up that said, is ageism as bad as the other isms and stuff? And I was thinking about that, about becoming of an age when you start to experience ageism. Just recently, I've had a couple of things, happen to me personally. I was in the grocery store, and I had a case of beer, and I put it up on the thing, and she went through and checked it and everything, and then when it got through the other end, can I help you with that? And I wanted to say, who do you think put it up on? And then not long ago, I was at my son and his wife they wanted to take pictures, and so of the whole family, and so we had a photographer, and we were at this park, and you had to come down this hill, come down this little hill and walk to where the photographer was, and my son and his wife went down, and the little kids went down, my grandkids, and then my husband and I start down the hill, and she says, "Be careful, Grandma and Grandpa, don't fall." Okay, you want to race? But it's just this, you look at somebody, and you make all these assumptions about them. And so, and then it occurred to me that, well, when you get older and you're a person of color, you got the double whammy. You get older and you're a woman, you get the double whammy. You get older and you're gay and you get the double whammy. I think I take your point for sure about women experiencing it more so than, say, like people who don't have other isms that they deal with, and I think that there are several categories where now you do get the double whammy. So I agree. Yes.
All right, one more from the home audience.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation. Based on your research and collaboration, what practical steps do you suggest we take to combat ageism in everyday life? Should we speak up when we see it or experience it?
Ooh, that's a great question. Should you speak up? Well, so let me just say something about the first part of the question. Is that what's being done here tonight is practical. What this program that Dr. Ensa was telling you about earlier is doing is practical. I think that awareness is key, right? It's very practical for people just to be aware. And then of course there's policies that are going to protect older people in the workplace and with regard to health care, and those kind of things have to happen, policies and laws and so forth. That's very practical. But to that last part of the question about whether or not you should speak up, what do y'all think?
Yes.
So can you what? Then you can be grumpy.
Well,
So
that's
yeah.
when you're labeled grumpy.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Oh, I see.
You know,
So
you kind of,
yeah.
hands are kind of tied if you do, and you have to take. Excuse me. You have to take it for what it is, you know, because they're going to label you one way or the other,
I see.
or both.
So okay. So maybe there's a difference between sticking up for yourself and sticking up for other people, for others. You know, I see young people all the time being very kind to older people and kind of, you know, letting others who aren't so kind know about it. So yeah, that's good. Are there any examples any of you can think of where, you know, yeah.
My son attends here at the U of A, and one of his heroes, when he was a little boy, because he developed the peanut butter press, as far as I remember, is George Washington Carver. And his favorite quote is, "Resolve to be tender with the young, compassionate with the aged, sympathetic with the striving, tolerant of the weak and the wrong. Sometimes in life you will have been all of these." I've also heard that quote with the wrong is the aged. So I'm not sure.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I think, you know, there are kind ways to speak up, right? So if you see someone else being unkind to an older person, you know, you might just suggest, hey, let's help her, or let's help him. And we don't have to be ugly to each other, but again, there's an awareness that it's going to help if people just understand that there's, you know, we're all different. Like Arthur Schopenhauer said, he was a sort of a pessimistic philosopher, and he just said, as a species, we're deeply flawed. So why pick on one group over another, because we're all a mess.
Hello? Okay, sorry. Thank you so much for your presentation. One thing you mentioned was like the different perspectives society has on the elderly people, where some societies or some people respect them, or some people think they're a nuisance. Could you speak about why there's such a dissonance in that public opinion on elderly people?
In terms of the negative, yeah, okay. Well, I don't think it's any secret that especially in the United States, and other Western type, what we would call Western type cultures, it's a youth culture. No, it just is, right? You know, it's good to be young and pretty. It's once we start to not be so young and pretty, we need to do something about it. You know, I mentioned all the anti-aging I don't know how many billions of dollars that industry is, but it's enormous, right? And it's not okay. It's not okay to be old or to look old, right? So we really do have a youth culture. I mean, the statistics about, you know, how, you know, even in Hollywood, older actors can't get jobs anymore, you know, and there's just so many ways in which youth is preferred. You know, and I think a lot of it is culturally instigated and by advertisers, and going back to what our doctor here was talking about is the consumerism. You know, things sell better when you have young, pretty people selling them, and so we just have this. We just sort of have this bias toward the young, and also I think that there's a fear associated with aging. And this goes back to that timeline thing I was talking about. We have such a notion of this, the finitude of this line, you know, that it has an end and we're racing toward it. And the more sunsets we see, the fewer sunrises we're going to see. So we better, you know, we either need to back it up and try to be younger, or we need to live faster, or we need to do something because it's bad to be old. You know, this is the message that we get. It's bad. It's bad to be old, and it comes from lots of places. Our preference for youth, our obsession with time, our notion of the finitude of our life. It's a lot of those things.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Howard. I am just delighted that you came tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming in. If you have questions, you know, we could probably filter them to you, or maybe you'd be willing to stay for a couple more minutes. But I think we have to close the session. And again, very important topic.
Thanks to all of you. Thank you very much for coming out tonight. Thank you.